It was one of those quiet evenings where the house felt almost too still. I was sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling through Lucas's tablet to find a chicken cacciatore recipe I'd promised to try. I wasn't looking for trouble, just something new for dinner. Then a little notification slid across the top of the screen. A name I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it might be a delivery update or a message from one of his colleagues. I tapped it without thinking. But the words that appeared made my stomach drop. "She can't give me pleasure the way you could." My hand froze mid-air, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, the room felt heavier, like even the air had turned against me. I scrolled up, my fingers trembling. The more I read, the more it burned. Weeks of flirty, intimate messages, inside jokes, late-night confessions, and then it hit me. The name at the top, his ex, of all people. My pulse pounded in my ears, but my face stayed calm, as if I were just reading a recipe. I leaned back in my chair, the tablet still in my hands, my reflection faintly staring back at me from the dark edges of the screen. My first instinct was to slam it shut, march into the living room and demand an explanation. But something in me, colder, sharper, whispered to wait. If I confronted him now, he'd only twist it, find a way to cover his tracks. I knew Lucas. He was quick with words, slippery when cornered. So instead, I kept reading. Each line felt like a little dagger, not just because of what was said, but because of how easily he'd said it. The way he reminisced about her, the way he made subtle digs at me without ever naming me outright. It was almost impressive how he could turn our marriage into a joke for her entertainment. By the time I reached the top of the thread, my mind had already shifted from shock to calculation. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just sat there, tapping the screen to take screenshot after screenshot, watching the evidence pile up like ammunition. I could feel the heat in my chest, but my face? Still calm. That was the moment I decided. He wasn't just going to regret this. He was going to remember it. I emailed every screenshot to myself, labeling the subject line so bland he'd never suspect a thing. Something like grocery list. I even attached them to a hidden folder in the cloud, just in case. The sound of his footsteps upstairs made me glance at the clock. He'd be coming down any second. My pulse slowed. I'd already decided there would be no tears for him tonight. When he walked into the kitchen, smiling like nothing in the world was wrong, I smiled right back. He kissed my cheek, asked if I'd found a recipe, and I told him I had. Something he'd love. My voice was steady, warm even, like I'd just spent the evening doing exactly what I'd planned. Inside, though, the wheels were turning. Every laugh, every casual touch from this moment on would have a purpose. Because this wasn't just about catching him. It was about how I'd make him pay. And I already knew I wouldn't be giving him the satisfaction of seeing it coming. That night, I lay in bed beside Lucas, listening to his steady breathing. The same rhythm I'd fallen asleep to for years now felt almost offensive. My body stayed perfectly still under the covers, but my mind was wide awake, replaying every word from those messages. My instinct kept tugging at me. Confront him, end it, rip the bandage off. But no. That would give him the chance to lie, to turn this into something it wasn't. Instead, I pictured the way his face would look when the truth finally landed in a place he couldn't escape from. The kind of moment that stripped away charm, excuses, and fake apologies. I wanted that. I wanted control. And I knew that meant staying quiet, at least for now. I turned my head toward him in the dark. He looked peaceful, almost innocent. It was strange. I felt no temptation to touch him, no urge to curl into the man I once trusted. If anything, there was a strange satisfaction in keeping my distance. He had no idea I was already holding the knife that would cut him down. The next morning, I woke before him, slipping out of bed quietly. In the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee filled the air, but I barely tasted it. My laptop sat open on the counter, and I pulled up the email with all the screenshots. Proof, neatly organized and waiting. Just seeing them again tightened something in my chest. But it wasn't sadness. It was resolve. When Lucas came downstairs, I greeted him like always. I poured his coffee, asked about his day, kissed his cheek before he left. The performance felt effortless, almost natural. Every smile I gave him was a disguise. Every "I love you" was a move on the chessboard. As the door closed behind him, I felt an odd calm settle over me. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was planning. And in planning, there was power. The kind of power he wouldn't see until it was far too late. That evening, I made sure everything felt ordinary. Dinner on the table, wine poured, the kind of small talk that keeps a marriage coasting. He laughed at his own jokes, told me about a meeting, completely unaware that every word he spoke only deepened my resolve. I studied him like a stranger, noticing the way his eyes darted when he spoke about his day, the way he avoided looking at me for too long. I realized then that this wasn't just about betrayal. It was about disrespect, about the casual ease with which he could feed me lies and still expect my loyalty. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. The man across from me wasn't my partner anymore. He was my project. So I listened, smiled, and nodded as if every word mattered to me. Inside, though, I was already sketching out the steps that would lead to his downfall. The trick would be to make him believe everything was fine, while I set the stage for a truth he couldn't run from. Over the next week, I became the wife Lucas probably wished I'd always been. Affectionate, attentive, and just a little clingy. I'd rest my hand on his arm while he talked, laugh a little louder at his jokes, and send him texts in the middle of the day telling him I missed him. Every move was deliberate. I wanted him to feel secure, to believe I was oblivious. It was almost amusing, watching how quickly he relaxed. The little defensiveness in his voice when I'd ask about his day disappeared. He started lingering in the kitchen with me after dinner, telling stories about work, as if we were rediscovering each other. If only he knew the only thing I was rediscovering was how easy it was to make him drop his guard. But behind the sweetness, I was working. I reached out to his ex under the guise of friendship, crafting a message that was warm, curious, and just suggestive enough to pique her interest. I told her about a charity event Lucas and I were hosting soon, and how I thought it'd be lovely if she came. She had no reason to refuse. When she replied with a casual, "Sounds fun," I felt the first real spark of satisfaction since finding those messages. I kept the tone light, even playful, as we exchanged details. She didn't suspect a thing. Why would she? In her mind, I was either clueless or incredibly naive. Let her think that. It only made what was coming more delicious. Meanwhile, I made sure Lucas was locked into the event without realizing it. I slipped it into conversation over dinner, mentioning how important it was for his business contacts, how we'd already promised we'd both attend. He nodded without hesitation, too busy savoring his meal to sense the trap tightening around him. Each night after he fell asleep, I'd lie awake replaying the plan in my head. The timing, the crowd, the exact moment the curtain would fall and the truth would spill into the room. The more I thought about it, the calmer I became. This wasn't just revenge anymore. This was art. In the days leading up to the event, I perfected my role. I cooked his favorite meals, laughed at the same recycled stories, even surprised him with little gestures. A handwritten note in his briefcase, a warm coffee waiting in the car. Every act painted the picture of a devoted wife, and he seemed almost smug about it, like he believed he'd won me over again. Behind closed doors, though, I was arranging every detail. The guest list was finalized. Friends, family, colleagues, and of course, her. I booked the AV team, requesting a projector for a short photo montage. They didn't need to know the nature of my slideshow. All they needed to do was hit play when I gave the signal. By the morning of the event, the pieces were perfectly aligned. Lucas was convinced he'd be walking into a night celebrating our marriage and his professional standing. What he didn't know was that by the time it ended, he'd be walking out with both in ruins. The night of the event, the air felt charged, almost electric. The venue was glowing under soft golden lights, tables dressed in white linen, the faint hum of conversation filling the room. I greeted guests with warm smiles and light touches on the arm, my dress chosen not just to flatter, but to command attention. Lucas stood beside me, beaming, shaking hands, completely oblivious to the storm gathering over his head. When she walked in, I felt my pulse steady, not race. She was dressed to impress, scanning the room with that mix of curiosity and confidence. I approached her as if we were old friends, exchanging a quick hug, my voice dripping with charm. Lucas caught sight of her moments later, his eyes flickering just enough for me to catch it, a flash of panic quickly buried under a smile. Dinner passed without a hitch. I made small talk, shared toasts, let the wine flow. Every minute was a step closer to the moment I'd been waiting for. And when the plates were cleared, I stood, my heels clicking softly on the stage, and took the microphone with the same calm you'd use to welcome guests into your home. I started the way anyone would, thanking everyone for coming, talking about the cause we were supporting tonight. Faces smiled back at me, glasses clinked softly. Then, with a gentle nod to the AV team, the slideshow began. At first, it was harmless. Photos of Lucas and me over the years, vacations, anniversaries, moments meant to warm the room. I watched him relax, even wrap his arm around the back of my chair. Then the next slide appeared. The text thread. The infamous line, bold on the big screen. "She can't give me pleasure the way you could." A ripple moved through the crowd. Soft gasps, awkward glances, a few muffled laughs. I didn't look at Lucas yet. I kept my eyes on the screen, letting the messages roll one after another. Dates, pet names, plans they'd made behind my back. Finally, I turned my head just enough to see him. His face had gone pale, lips slightly parted, eyes darting like a cornered animal. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. Across the room, his ex's smile had vanished. She stood frozen for a beat, then grabbed her clutch and walked out without a word, the sound of her heels sharp against the floor. The silence in the room thickened, every eye now fixed on Lucas. I handed the microphone back to the host with a gracious nod, as though I'd just finished thanking everyone for dessert. Lucas leaned toward me, whispering my name like a plea, but I stepped away before he could touch me. I could feel the weight of the audience's stares, some shocked, some entertained, others quietly approving. This wasn't just a reveal. It was a reckoning. I made my way to the edge of the stage, my movements unhurried, my smile calm. Because the best part wasn't what had just happened. The best part was knowing there was still one final move left to play. Lucas caught up to me near the back of the room, his hand brushing my arm like he could pull me back into whatever illusion we'd been living in. His voice was low, desperate, laced with the kind of panic that comes only when someone realizes they've lost control. I turned to face him, my expression still warm, almost kind, the way you'd look at someone you'd already decided to walk away from. From my clutch, I pulled out a manila envelope, thick and deliberate, and placed it in his hands. Inside were the divorce papers, neatly signed, along with printed copies of every screenshot I'd saved. His fingers gripped the edge of the envelope, knuckles whitening as he glanced around, aware of the audience still watching. I leaned in just enough for only him to hear. "I may not give you pleasure," I said softly, "but I sure know how to take away your peace." The words landed like a quiet strike, and for a moment, he just stood there, unable to respond. I didn't wait for him to open the envelope. His reaction didn't matter anymore. I already knew the ending to this story. I stepped away, letting the crowd swallow him in a haze of whispers and judgment. A few guests looked at me with wide eyes, others with small, knowing smiles, as if they'd been silently rooting for this moment all along. The music had stopped, the hum of conversation now replaced by the charged silence of a room that had witnessed too much. I kept my head high, my stride steady, as if I were leaving an event exactly as planned. Because I was. This was the finale I'd orchestrated, down to the last detail. At the doors, one of Lucas's business associates caught my eye. He gave the smallest nod, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had just happened. I returned it with a faint smile before stepping out into the crisp night air, where the weight of the room finally lifted from my shoulders. Outside, the cool night wrapped around me like a clean slate. The muffled sounds of the event faded behind the closed doors, replaced by the gentle hum of the city. I could still feel the adrenaline coursing through me, but it wasn't chaos anymore. It was clarity. Each step I took away from that building felt like reclaiming a piece of myself he'd tried to diminish. As I reached the curb, a small wave of applause rose from a cluster of guests who had followed me out. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me pause. I met their eyes briefly, accepting the moment without words. This wasn't about their approval, but it didn't hurt to have it. A car pulled up, and I slid inside without looking back. Lucas's world was burning behind me, but mine was just beginning. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about what he'd done. I was thinking about what I'd do next, and I had no intention of living quietly.
Your investment portfolio has been liquidated in full. The notification appeared on my phone during an important client meeting. I excused myself hastily, trying to maintain composure as I stepped into the hallway. This wasn't possible. Andrew and I had agreed never to touch our retirement savings without mutual consent. My fingers trembled as I called his number, only to be met with a businesslike voicemail greeting that suddenly sounded foreign to my ears. 3 hours and 17 unanswered calls later, I received a text message. "Rebecca, I need space to figure things out. Don't try to contact me for a while." After 12 years of marriage, this was how my husband chose to communicate that he was walking away from our life together. What I didn't realize then was that he had taken far more than just his belongings. My name is Rebecca Mitchell, 37 years old and CFO of a mid-sized marketing firm in Seattle. Andrew, 39, worked as an investment advisor at a prestigious financial institution. We lived in a modern loft downtown with our exceptionally gifted 11-year-old daughter, Zoe. We appeared to be the perfect professional couple: successful careers, intelligent child, financial stability. The facade couldn't have been more convincing. For the past year, Andrew had been pushing to diversify our investment strategy, insisting we consolidate our accounts under his management. It makes sense for the financial expert in the family to handle this, he'd said with that charming smile that once made my heart flutter. I'd reluctantly agreed, transferring control of the $450,000 we diligently saved over our marriage. When I arrived home that evening, I found Zoe sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, her dark curls falling over her face as she hunched over her laptop. "Where's Dad?" she asked without looking up, fingers continuing to tap methodically on the keyboard. "He's working late," I replied, the lie bitter on my tongue. "What are you working on so intently?" "Just a coding project," she said, still not meeting my eyes. "Dad's been acting weird lately. Is everything okay with you two?" Zoe had always been perceptive beyond her years, with an analytical mind that seemed to process information at lightning speed. At school, she was already taking advanced placement computer science, and at home, she spent hours teaching herself programming languages from online courses. "Let's talk about it over dinner," I said, buying myself time to figure out how to explain something I barely understood myself. Over microwave leftovers, I told Zoe a watered-down version of the truth, that her father needed some time away, but that everything would be fine. She listened silently, her expression inscrutable, then asked one cutting question. "Did he take the money from your investment accounts?" I nearly choked on my water. "How could you possibly know about that?" Last week, I overheard him on the phone talking about liquidation timelines and offshore transfers. She explained matter-of-factly. He said something about Panama being secure. My blood ran cold. Offshore accounts in Panama meant Andrew had been planning this for quite some time. While I'd been focused on my recent promotion, my husband had been systematically preparing to disappear with our life savings. That night, after Zoe went to bed, I searched Andrew's home office desperately looking for clues. His desktop computer was gone, but in a recycling bin, I found a crumpled receipt from a storage facility. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years and drove to the address on the receipt. The facility manager confirmed that Andrew Mitchell had indeed rented a unit, but was unhelpful beyond that. As I sat in my car contemplating my next move, my phone rang, an unknown number. Rebecca Mitchell. The voice was professional, detached. Speaking. This is Detective Sandra Reeves with Seattle PD. We've received some concerning information regarding your husband, Andrew Mitchell. Would you be available to come to the station today? The detective's office was sparse and functional. She explained that Andrew's name had come up in an investigation into a sophisticated investment scheme targeting high-net-worth individuals. We believe your husband may have been involved in diverting client funds, she said carefully. Have you noticed anything unusual in his behavior recently? I laughed hollowly. Besides him disappearing yesterday and emptying our joint investment accounts, nothing at all. By the time I returned home, my shock had morphed into a seething anger. I had built my career on financial acumen, yet I failed to see the deception happening under my own roof. I found Zoe, not in her room but sitting at the kitchen counter, her laptop open. Mom, I think I found something, she said without preamble. I've been running a program to track Dad's digital footprint. You've been what? I asked, momentarily distracted from my anger. I created a simple algorithm that aggregates public data and cross-references it with known patterns, she explained, as if it were the most natural thing for an 11-year-old to do. Dad's been sloppy with his digital security. He's using his secondary email to communicate with someone named Elise Parker. And they've been discussing property in Belize. Zoe, what you're doing might not be entirely legal, I cautioned, even as I leaned closer to the screen. Neither is what Dad did, she countered, a hardness in her voice I'd never heard before. Besides, I'm just connecting publicly available information. Over the next 2 days, Zoe and I barely slept as we pieced together Andrew's movements. We discovered he had been seeing this Elise woman for at least 8 months. More disturbingly, we found evidence that some of the funds he transferred weren't even ours. They belonged to his clients. On the 3rd day, I received a call from our bank. There had been a suspicious attempt to access our home equity line of credit remotely. The transaction had been flagged and frozen. That was him, I told Zoe after hanging up. He's trying to drain the house value now. Then he's getting desperate, she observed. The algorithm shows he's still in the country, Mom. The Belize property purchase hasn't gone through yet. That evening, my doorbell rang. Detective Reeves stood outside with a colleague. We've received information about your husband's whereabouts, she said. We believe he's planning to leave the country within 48 hours. We need your help. The plan was simple but risky. I would contact Andrew, tell him I'd discovered additional funds in a private account, and suggest meeting to discuss a quiet divorce settlement. Meanwhile, the police would be waiting to apprehend him. It's too dangerous, Zoe protested when I explained it to her. He's not thinking rationally right now. It's our best chance to recover what he stole, I insisted. Then let me help, she said firmly. I can track his phone location in real time once he responds to your message. The police won't need to expose you at all. After some debate, Detective Reeves agreed to Zoe's modification of the plan, impressed by her technical knowledge despite initial reservations about involving a child. I sent the message to Andrew that evening. I know what you've done. I also have access to funds you don't know about. If you want to avoid charges, meet me tomorrow to discuss terms. His response came within minutes. Millennium Hotel, room 842, 2 p.m., come alone. The following day, as I prepared to leave for the meeting, Zoe grabbed my hand. I set up a real-time tracker using the hotel's public Wi-Fi network. The moment he connects, we'll know exactly where he is. The police are already positioned in the hotel. How did you even? I began, then shook my head. Never mind. I don't think I want to know. Probably not, she agreed with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. When I arrived at the hotel, Detective Reeves confirmed through my earpiece that Andrew had indeed checked in but had registered under a false name. According to Zoe's tracking, he was currently in the hotel lobby, not in room 842. He's setting up a trap, Reeves concluded. Stay in the car. 20 minutes later, I watched as the police escorted Andrew from the hotel in handcuffs. Behind him came a tall, elegant woman who I assumed was Elise Parker, also in restraints. At the station, Andrew refused to speak to me, but Detective Reeves provided the details. They had found documents in his hotel room outlining the entire scheme. Client funds diverted through a maze of accounts, plans for a new identity in Belize, even a fabricated backstory to explain his sudden wealth. What about our money? I asked. The funds he transferred from our accounts. Most of it has been frozen before it could leave the country, she explained. Financial Crimes is working on recovery, but it may take some time. And the clients he stole from. That's a separate investigation, she said grimly. He'll be facing multiple felony charges. That night, Zoe and I sat on our balcony overlooking the city lights, processing everything that had happened. How are you doing with all this? I asked her, suddenly aware of how much I'd leaned on my daughter's remarkable abilities without considering the emotional toll. I'm angry, she said simply. Not just that he was willing to abandon us, but that he thought he was smart enough to get away with it. She closed her laptop with a decisive click. I'm also kind of proud of what we did. We outsmarted him. We did. I agreed, putting my arm around her shoulders. But we still have a long road ahead. The weeks that followed brought a cascade of revelations. Andrew's scheme had affected dozens of clients, people who had trusted him with their life savings. The investigation uncovered evidence that Elise Parker, who turned out to be a former compliance officer at Andrew's firm, had been instrumental in helping him bypass security protocols. In a bizarre twist, Andrew attempted to blame me for the missing client funds, claiming I had orchestrated the entire operation using my position as CFO. The accusation might have gained traction if Zoe hadn't meticulously documented the digital trail of his activities, creating a timeline that clearly exonerated me. 3 months after Andrew's arrest, I sat in a courtroom listening as he was sentenced to 12 years for fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. Elise received 8 years for her role in the scheme. As part of the plea agreement, Andrew surrendered all assets, including the properties in Belize and the contents of the storage unit, which turned out to contain luxury items purchased with stolen funds. Recovery was a gradual process. The financial aspect was straightforward. Most of our savings were restored, and I worked out a payment plan for the remainder. The emotional healing was more complicated. Zoe began seeing a therapist specializing in children affected by parental betrayal, while I threw myself into rebuilding our lives. I took a sabbatical from my CFO position to establish a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating people about financial fraud protection. Zoe, channeling her technological talents constructively, developed a simple app to help people monitor suspicious activities in their accounts. 6 months after Andrew's sentencing, I received an unexpected call from Detective Reeves. I thought you might want to know, she said. Your ex-husband has been attempting to manipulate the system from prison, trying to access hidden accounts we hadn't identified. Did he succeed? I asked, my heart racing. No, she replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Your daughter's tracking algorithm was more thorough than our forensic accountants. All funds have been secured and will be returned to the victims. That evening, I shared the news with Zoe over dinner at her favorite restaurant. So he's still trying to beat the system, she remarked, thoughtfully twirling pasta around her fork. And still failing, I added. Thanks to you. She shrugged, but I could see the quiet pride in her eyes. I'm thinking about studying cybersecurity when I go to college, she said. There's a summer program at the university for high school students. I know I'm a few years too young, but Professor Liu said they might make an exception based on my coding skills. That sounds perfect for you, I told her, marveling at her resilience. Where I had seen betrayal as an ending, she had found in it a beginning, a pathway to her future. 1 year to the day after Andrew's disappearance, I stood in our redecorated loft, preparing to host a small gathering of friends who had supported us through the ordeal. The detective was coming, as were several colleagues who had never wavered in their belief in my innocence. As I arranged flowers in a vase, Zoe emerged from her room, laptop in hand as always. "I've been thinking," she said, leaning against the counter. "We should probably talk about college funds soon. I've been researching scholarships, but it wouldn't hurt to start saving specifically for education." I laughed, struck by the role reversal, my preteen daughter planning for her financial future with the caution of someone who had learned life's lessons the hard way. "You're right," I agreed. "But this time, we'll manage the accounts together. 2 pairs of eyes are better than 1. 3 actually," she corrected, tapping her laptop. "I've programmed an alert system that monitors for unusual patterns. It's not that I don't trust you," she added quickly. "It's just a good safeguard," I finished for her. I couldn't agree more. As our guests began to arrive, I reflected on how differently things might have turned out without Zoe's remarkable mind and determination. Andrew had underestimated both of us, assuming I would be too devastated to fight back and overlooking Zoe entirely as a potential threat to his plans. His greatest miscalculation wasn't in the execution of his scheme, but in his assessment of what he was leaving behind. Not a helpless wife and child, but a formidable team that would ultimately bring about his downfall. Sometimes betrayal becomes the catalyst for discovering strengths you never knew you possessed. In losing what I thought was a perfect marriage, I had gained something far more valuable: an unshakable bond with my daughter and the knowledge that together, we could overcome whatever challenges life presented next. The lawyer slid the property deed across his polished mahogany desk, his expression edged with discomfort. "I'm afraid this is all that remains of your grandfather's estate, Miss Carter." The medical expenses consumed everything else. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses as if reluctant to meet my gaze. "The property taxes are covered through the end of the year, but beyond that, well, the cabin itself holds little market value." I stared at the yellowed document, watching dust motes swirl in the golden afternoon light filtering through the Venetian blinds. Grandfather James had always been a mystery, a wanderer who appeared without warning, bearing strange gifts from distant places only to vanish again with vague mentions of research. His final return, forced by illness, had done little to unravel his secrets. Even as pancreatic cancer wasted him away, he spent his final months locked away in his study, emerging only for doctor visits and cryptic, fragmented conversations. "There's also this," the lawyer added, placing an old brass key beside the deed. The key was heavy in an unnatural way, its surface etched with swirling patterns of vines and celestial symbols. Tarnished with age, it looked as though it belonged to another century, perhaps even another world. "Your grandfather was insistent that you receive this personally," the lawyer continued. "He said, and I quote, 'When the time comes, she'll understand.' He made a point of it." I ran my fingers over the cool metal, tracing the intricate design. "Did he ever mention what it unlocks?" The lawyer shook his head. "Not a word. James was eccentric, to say the least. The few times I met with him, he seemed far more interested in discussing planetary alignments than legal affairs." He closed the folder on his desk with a definitive thud. "I'm sorry there wasn't more, given your circumstances." "My circumstances?" A delicate way of referring to my divorce, the exhausting custody battle, and the barely surviving freelance business that barely kept us afloat. At 36, this wasn't the life I'd envisioned. Single, financially strained, navigating a shared custody arrangement with an ex-husband who had decided family life stifled his creative freedom. Still, I forced a smile. "Thank you. My grandfather was always unconventional. I didn't expect much." But that wasn't entirely true. I hadn't expected wealth, but I had hoped for something, an explanation maybe, or at least a clearer picture of the man who had flitted in and out of my life like a shadow. 2 weeks later, I loaded up my car, strapped my 9-year-old daughter Lily into the passenger seat, and made the 3-hour drive from Portland to the remote woodland property near Mount Hood. The road turned rough as we neared our destination, the trees closing in like silent sentinels. Then, as we crested the final bend, the cabin came into view. It was smaller than I remembered, and in worse shape. The roof sagged on one side, the once blue paint had faded to a ghostly gray, peeling in ragged strips to reveal weathered logs beneath. The porch leaned precariously, and an old shed stood to one side, its door barely clinging to a single rusted hinge. "Mom, it looks like a witch's house," Lily gasped, eyes wide with delight. "Can we keep it? Please say we're keeping it." I hesitated, taking in the dilapidated state of the place. "It needs work," I admitted. "But it's ours now. We'll see what we can do with it." A real estate agent in Portland had been blunt. "The land has some value, but the structure, you'd be better off tearing it down." But I couldn't bring myself to discard this last piece of my grandfather without at least stepping inside. The interior was surprisingly intact, dusty but undisturbed. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, flanked by built-in shelves filled with time-worn books. A small kitchen stood in one corner, its appliances relics from another era. The loft above, reachable by a narrow ladder, held a single bed and a trunk of old linens. A second, smaller bedroom tucked behind the kitchen completed the modest layout. "It smells like Grandpa," Lily murmured, running her fingers along the spines of the books. "Like that special tea he used to drink." She was right. The air carried the same scent I remembered from my childhood. Earthy, laced with spices I could never quite identify. The familiarity of it tightened something in my chest. That weekend, we simply explored. The well still pumped water. The old wiring miraculously held up, and though there was no internet or reliable cell service, Lily quickly forgot her initial complaints when she found a trunk of board games in the loft. By Sunday evening, as we prepared to leave, I made a decision. "What would you think about spending the summer here?" I asked, watching her sift through an old puzzle box. "I can work remotely, and we could fix it up a bit." Lily's face lit up. "Really? We can stay." Her enthusiasm sealed it. The cabin offered something we both needed: space to heal, to breathe, and maybe, just maybe, to finally understand my grandfather's secrets. Over the next few weeks, we settled into a routine of slow restoration. I patched the roof, repaired the porch, and scrubbed years of dust and grime from the wooden floors. Lily, ever the adventurer, took it upon herself to document everything in a notebook she titled The Mystery of Grandpa's Cabin. One sweltering Saturday in late June, she made a discovery that would change everything. "Mom," she called from the fireplace, her hands blackened with soot. "There's a loose stone here." I crouched beside her as she wiggled the small stone free, revealing a narrow cavity behind it. "What do you think is inside?" she whispered. "Probably just an old hiding spot," I mused, peering into the darkness. People used to stash valuables in fireplaces before banks were common. We found nothing that day, but the discovery ignited a deeper curiosity. Over the following weeks, we uncovered more hidden compartments, behind a loose board in the loft, beneath a warped floorboard, inside a false bottom drawer in the kitchen. Most were empty, but some held artifacts that defied explanation. A compass etched with unfamiliar markings, a bundle of brittle letters in a language I didn't recognize, a small leather-bound notebook filled with pages of coded symbols and cryptic notes. And then, one evening, as the sun bled gold through the trees, Lily found something else. A hidden door. Half buried beneath the cabin's foundation, concealed behind decades of overgrown ivy and decayed wood, it was barely visible. But there was no mistaking it. And as I traced the edge of the lock, my breath caught. The intricate pattern on the key my grandfather left me matched it exactly. "When the time comes, you'll understand," he had said. My fingers trembled as I lifted the key, fitting it into place. With a soft, echoing click, the door creaked open, and our lives were never the same again. As we continued restoring the cabin, we uncovered more peculiarities: strange symbols carved into the wooden beams overhead, intricate patterns in the floorboards that only became visible when the afternoon sun struck them at just the right angle, and shelves lined with books written in languages neither of us recognized. Some volumes focus on geology, others on astronomy, and many contained hand-drawn maps marked with symbols identical to those on my grandfather's brass key. Grandpa James was definitely unconventional, I murmured one evening, sifting through a drawer filled with odd trinkets, compasses, empty vials, and astronomical charts so detailed they looked like they belonged in an observatory. "I think he was cool," Lily countered, slipping on a peculiar pair of spectacles with tinted lenses. She twirled in place, then gasped. "Whoa, these make everything look purple. And look, some things glow." She pointed at a rock specimen on the shelf, and sure enough, through the strange lenses, it emitted a faint, eerie luminescence. By July, the cabin had transformed. The once dilapidated structure now stood sturdy and inviting, painted deep forest green, with fresh porch steps and a cozy interior filled with thrifted furniture and warm touches. My work had slowed slightly, but a new client, a scientific publishing house in need of technical illustrations, provided a steady income. Our days found a rhythm. Mornings were spent on work and lessons. I had decided to homeschool Lily part-time for the summer, using my grandfather's extensive library as our curriculum. Afternoons were for adventure, hiking through the dense forest, swimming in the hidden lake a half-mile from the cabin, or continuing our investigation of the property's many mysteries. Then, one fateful afternoon, everything changed. I was repainting the kitchen cabinets when Lily's excited voice rang out from the basement, sharp with urgency. Mom, I found something weird. Dropping my brush, I rushed down the narrow wooden steps, the air growing cool and damp as I entered the small, earthen-floored space. Lily stood in front of the stone wall at the back of the basement, her hands smudged with dust and excitement blazing in her hazel eyes. I was bouncing my ball, and it hit right here, she explained, tapping a spot in the masonry. It sounded hollow. I pressed my hand against the wall, running my fingers along the surface until I, too, felt the subtle seam. A thrill of possibility ran through me. It could just be a secret door. Lily interrupted, practically vibrating with excitement. Like in my books. We have to open it. For nearly an hour, we searched for a mechanism, pressing every stone, testing every possible trigger. Just as I was about to suggest taking a break, Lily grabbed my arm, her expression alight with realization. The key, Mom, the one Grandpa left you. My breath caught. The brass key, the one I had absent-mindedly tucked into my handbag, had seemed like little more than a sentimental heirloom. But now, I retrieved it and held it in my palm, its weight suddenly significant. Lily pointed to a small discolored section of mortar near the floor. There's something there. Look closely. She was right. Nearly imperceptible in the dim basement light was a keyhole, cleverly disguised within the rough texture of the wall. With trembling fingers, I inserted the key. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, resonant click, ancient gears ground to life. A section of the stone wall swung inward, revealing a dark passageway. I switched on my phone's flashlight, the beam illuminating a short, narrow corridor carved into the bedrock beneath the cabin. The air smelled different, older, untouched. A thrill of apprehension and exhilaration coursed through me. Stay behind me, Lily, I murmured. No way, she whispered, clutching my hand tightly. We're doing this together. The corridor stretched for about 10 feet before opening into a chamber, circular, carved entirely from stone. As we stepped inside, soft overhead lights flickered on, revealing a space that took my breath away. In the center stood a massive stone table, its surface covered in neatly arranged documents, maps, and what appeared to be scientific instruments. The walls were lined with shelves brimming with leather-bound journals, wooden chests, and artifacts that looked like they belonged in a museum. Against one wall, a strange device resembling an antique telescope was mounted, aimed at a narrow opening in the ceiling, an observatory of sorts. Cabinets with glass fronts displayed rock specimens labeled in my grandfather's meticulous handwriting. A series of old-fashioned drawers held rolled-up maps, some so ancient their edges had frayed to near dust. Lily spun in a slow circle, taking it all in. Mom, she whispered in awe, what is this place? I don't know, I admitted, pulling a journal from one of the shelves. It was filled with my grandfather's crisp handwriting, accompanied by precise sketches of celestial bodies, mathematical equations, and maps. So many maps, each marked with symbols that now felt eerily familiar. A folded document slipped from between the pages, landing on the stone table. My stomach tightened as I unfolded it. It was a deed, similar to the one for the cabin, but far older, written on parchment rather than modern paper. My breath caught in my throat. What is it? Lily asked. I scanned the document, my heart pounding. It's a mining claim, I murmured. From 1887. For a gold mine in the Cascade Mountains. And according to this addendum, it's still valid. Lily's eyes widened. Wait, Grandpa left us a gold mine. I looked up from the parchment, my pulse hammering. Apparently, yes. But the mine was only part of the secret. As we pored over my grandfather's journals, the full picture began to emerge. He hadn't been just an eccentric scientist, he had been a visionary, a self-taught geologist and astronomer who had spent decades developing sustainable, environmentally conscious methods of mineral extraction. He had discovered a way to mine gold without the devastating environmental consequences, techniques that could have revolutionized the industry. "Listen to this," I said, reading aloud from a journal entry dated 1982. "Conventional mining would destroy this land, leaving only ruin. The methods I've developed could change everything, but they threaten too many powerful interests. It's safer to wait, to pass this knowledge on when the time is right." Lily leaned over the journal, her expression fierce with determination. "Mom, this isn't just a treasure map. It's bigger than that. Grandpa left us a way to fix things." I exhaled, the weight of our discovery settling in my bones. "Yes," I murmured. "And now we have to decide what to do with it." That night, we slept in the cabin with a new awareness of what lay beneath our feet. The next morning, I made my first calls to attorneys who specialize in mineral rights and intellectual property. Over the following weeks, we carefully cataloged my grandfather's research, digitizing his notes and trying to comprehend the full scale of what he had left behind. By summer's end, we had made our decision. Instead of selling his work to the highest bidder, we would honor his legacy. We would create something lasting, something that would change the way the world viewed resource extraction. And so, the James Carter Foundation for Sustainable Resource Management was born. What had begun as an inheritance of a crumbling cabin and a mysterious key had become something far greater. A legacy of knowledge, innovation, and hope for the future. And it was only the beginning. A year after discovering the hidden chamber, I stood at the entrance of what was once an abandoned mine, now a demonstration site for sustainable resource extraction. Lily, wearing her oversized safety helmet and the strange tinted spectacles we'd found months ago, nudged me. "Do you think Grandpa James would be proud?" she asked. I glanced at the team of geologists and engineers setting up their equipment, all marveling at how accurate my grandfather's predictions had been. His revolutionary techniques were finally being put into practice, not just for profit, but to teach a better way forward. "I think this is exactly what he wanted," I said, squeezing her hand. "Then we better not mess it up," she grinned. Life had transformed since that summer. The cabin was no longer just a home. It had become a research hub. My design work now focused on environmental communication, while Lily, once a quiet bookworm, had blossomed into a budding scientist. Even my ex-husband, once skeptical, had started bringing her here on weekends, admitting, begrudgingly, that it was educational. But the biggest change had been within me. I was no longer just surviving. I had a purpose. My grandfather's secrecy, once frustrating, now made sense. He had been protecting his work until the right moment, until I was ready. That evening, as Lily and I sat on the cabin's porch, watching the stars emerge, she leaned against me. "You figured it out, Mom," she said. "That's why Grandpa trusted you." I touched the brass key hanging around my neck, a symbol of the past unlocking the future. The real inheritance hadn't been gold. It had been the chance to build something lasting, something that mattered. And sometimes, the greatest treasures aren't buried in the earth, but in the choices we make when we finally discover them.